On this episode of the podcast, I am bursting with excitement to be speaking with Cathy Oke in Melbourne, Australia. First, about the city. Melbourne is located in southeastern Australia and has a population of 5 million, making it the second most populous city in the land down under. As a former tennis player myself, I am most familiar with Melbourne as the host of the annual Australian Open tennis tournament. Now to introduce Cathy, who I feel more comfortable calling Dr. Oke because she earned a PhD in molecular science. Dr. Oke has served as an elected member of Melbourne City Council since 2008. At City Council, she is chair of the Environment Portfolio. As if this doesn't keep her busy enough, Dr. Oke also works at the University of Melbourne, where she leads the Connected Cities Lab. Further, she is the first vice president of ICLEI, which is the International Council for Local Environment Initiatives. Thank you so much for your time today. Let's jump right in. Why is it becoming more and more important for cities to engage in global issues? Do you think that every large city at least should conduct their own diplomacy beyond that of their national government?
Like all of these things to do with cities, it's all very dependent on the city. You know, context is important, but certainly the old adage of acting local, thinking global is very relevant here. I think that as urban areas become bigger and certainly more and more people live and work in cities, I think it's really important that the decisions that we make, even though they are, of course, about issues that are relevant in the local context, the impact is global. And so making decisions around how to develop your city in a sustainable way, given, population growth and climate change. And, so the decisions that you make, whilst, of course, first and foremost have to be thinking about your local residents, there are global implications. And when I said before about local context being important, it depends on the levers that you have, and every city is different, whether you control the transport or the water authorities, or whether you've got, a lot of public land or majority private land, and depending on the politics of the different levels of government within your region or within your country, those sort of details depend on how much you want to play globally as a city. Either way, I think it's really important for cities to be part of that the global conversation around sustainable development or climate change, and be engaged in the United Nations frameworks like the climate conferences or the sustainable development goals. It's important to understand, how the decisions that you make impact the wider world. And there's so much you can learn from other cities and other nations and other regions anyway. So certainly city diplomacy and connecting and negotiating in a global sphere is important.
Great. And speaking of the SDGs, I saw that Melbourne did a desktop assessment of the SDGs back in 2017. So, I'll ask, were you involved in that? I'll assume that you were. And then the follow-up is, does the city plan on conducting another one soon, since it's been 3 years? And if so, do you think you might do it within the framework of the voluntary local review?
Yes, certainly. The City of Melbourne did conduct an assessment of the Sustainable Development Goals a few years ago, and yes, that was a result of a request of myself to engage again in another global framework. We've been active in global fora like the climate conferences and biodiversity conferences, and it's very important, I thought, with the new 2030 global goals for the City of Melbourne to understand what they might mean to us. And so the assessment done in 2017 did pretty much just that, a desktop review of all the different goals and how all the different strategies and plans and policies that we had in place align. Very pleased to note that very recently, in fact, I think it was last week, at the City of Melbourne, we have agreed a new annual plan initiative about integrating the Sustainable Development Goals. And this project is really to significantly build on that initial work and determine the best way to integrate and embed the SDGs into strategies and plannings, and to the voluntary local review movement, develop our own local index. So that's about, understanding what the locally relevant indicators might be for the City of Melbourne, and setting up a framework to monitor them over time. And that's become even more important in this, as the city looks to recovery from COVID. What's the best framework to do that? And I'm really glad that the City of Melbourne is looking to the Sustainable Development Goals as the framework to think about what the city should look like, or how it should or could recover. And yes, certainly looking to cities like New York City and all of the Japanese cities that were very much involved in the, starting up the VLR movement a few years ago, certainly looking to what those cities are doing with their voluntary local reviews. And hopefully the City of Melbourne will have one, towards the start of next year.
That's so exciting. Thanks for sharing that news.
Yes.
So obviously we know, but as a reminder for listeners, there's 17 SDGs. So what are the top 3 most important SDGs to Melbourne, and why?
Particularly in the light of our conversation just now about the voluntary local review, it's really looking at all 17 of them and seeing how they relate to the City of Melbourne, because you want to not necessarily look at them in isolation, but how all of them are all interrelated and how they integrate. But certainly in the City of Melbourne, we climate change and climate action is very important to us, and a lot of the work that we have in place within our climate action, climate resilient work is about life on land and biodiversity, but also climate change and making decisions that will cool our city and make it better for not only our people that live here, but also nature. So biodiversity are really important SDGs for us. But then also, obviously, equality and equity. And so SDGs relating to housing and affordable housing is a big issue in many cities. And of course, it is in Melbourne as well. And how do we make sure that our capital city is affordable? So SDGs around affordability is really important, and homelessness is a big issue in the City of Melbourne as well. And so the SDGs relating to homelessness and ending poverty and inequality are really important. And whilst there isn't an explicit sustainable development goal around Indigenous issues and First Peoples, certainly the City of Melbourne has a strong and important goal around Aboriginal people, and in Melbourne, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who call Melbourne home, and certainly we're on the traditional lands of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people in Melbourne, and Aboriginal issues are really important. So we would be looking to forefronting Indigenous perspectives of the SDGs in the work that we're undertaking.
That's really great to hear. I want to move on to some of your involvements outside of City Hall.
Okay.
You're the first vice president for ICLEI, which is a city network of local governments for sustainability. Why did you become involved in ICLEI in the beginning? How active is it now? And third, could you please talk about the rise of international city networks? I watched a video recently where your colleague Mikel Akuto says there are about 200 active city networks today.
Yes, certainly there are. Gosh, there's lots in that. But if I start with ICLEI, which is a very big city network, ICLEI is local governments for sustainability. There are, I believe, 22 offices around the world, and upwards of 2,000 cities or regions involved as members. It's a membership organisation, particularly looking at issues around resilience and climate change, and all manners of sustainability Um, well, I got involved because the city of Melbourne was the host city for ICLEI in the Oceania region. And so when I was first elected in 2008 and took on the portfolio, the environment portfolio, which I'm still the chair of the environment portfolio, to now I got involved in ICLEI, joined the regional executive committee, and that led to me joining the global executive committee. And over the last 11 years, I've been in various governance positions, including I chair the World Secretariat Board as well. And I'm really proud of what ICLEI does. And there are many city networks, and they each have a different issue or a different objective or a different purpose, whether it's around climate change like the C40s and the UCLGs and Eurocities and ICLEIs. There are many excellent city networks looking at sustainable issues. But then there are also city networks looking at migration, and so the global migration councils, and there's data network exchange and arts, and there's city networks that name the topic. And this goes to your question before around city diplomacy or city networking. It's about cities working together on issues of common issues that they have in common, so that they can learn and share, and in a lot of parts advocate together for greater resources for those particular issues. Back to ICLEI, what I was saying before, I'm very proud of the work that ICLEI has done in the global sphere, particularly at the climate negotiations in advocating for the role of cities, because the United Nations are about nations. It's the member states are the countries, and in many countries around the world, it is cities that are often leading when it comes to climate change. And policy around climate change is lacking in many countries, including Australia. And yet we know that the impacts of climate change are very much seen and will be seen even more so in our cities in the future. And so if the nations aren't there advocating on behalf of what's really important, then it's up to the city leaders to take on that role. It's really important for cities to be recognised formally, because it can lead to capacity building and technology exchange, and it can lead to financial benefits for cities, and in particular for cities, as they say in the global south, but the less developed cities. So from a City of Melbourne perspective, I've never gone along and advocated necessarily for resources to flow to a fairly wealthy city like the City of Melbourne, but rather through ICLEI, you're there advocating on behalf of all local government, and in particular for those that may not have the resources to advocate for themselves. So, it's been a really important process. And just another thing, I've been really proud of the work that ICLEI is doing with biodiversity and nature in cities. And there's a platform that I've been really involved in called Cities with Nature that ICLEI established with the IUCN and also the Nature Conservancy. And it's, again, it's an advocacy platform and program all about nature in cities, and increasing the focus on bringing nature back into cities and biodiversity in particular. And the climate conferences have got a lot of focus, but there is other UN processes around biodiversity, and the Convention for Biological Diversity was to be this year, but next year the next conference of the parties around biodiversity will be looking at the new global framework for nature. And it's really important that cities are in there advocating for the role of cities for bringing back nature and for biodiversity in particular. And that's really, really important for cities to get involved in that global advocacy, because decisions are being made that really do impact the work that they're undertaking.
Honestly, I don't understand how you sleep. As you've been a city councillor for 12 years, you're first vice president of ICLEI, and you also work at the University of Melbourne. From your perspective, what role does academia need to play in the global achievement of the SDGs?
I I guess it helps to be really interested and passionate in all the things that you're involved in. And certainly I'm very lucky to be involved in many interesting things in my role as a counsellor. But it's through my role as a counsellor, but with a background in science, that I really understand the importance of evidence-based policy making. And I know that there's this wealth of information out there in academia that if we could get it, in a form that policymakers or decision makers could really understand, that knowledge translation, then, I feel that we would have a whole lot better policy being written or being made, or decisions being made. And so I'm really interested in that interface between policy, practice, and research. And how do we work better or partner better across those disciplines so that we can see the transitions that we need for sustainable development. And so when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, that's really what led me to this project, this participatory action project that's being led out of my lab, the Connected Cities Lab at the University of Melbourne. This cities SDG challenge is all about, how do we get the expertise in academia, the expertise in business and industry, and the expertise in government to come together to really try and implement the SDGs, because the Millennium Development Goals are excellent on paper and in how we'd want the city or how the world to be, but I don't think any of them, maybe one of them was achieved, and 2030 is not that far away. And if we want the SDGs to be resolved, or not resolved, but at least somewhat achieved, then we need everyone to be working together. And so that, the role of academia is really understanding what the needs are of cities or institutions that are making decisions and bringing expertise in the right way. That's an area of great interest of mine.
That's great. And you brought up the SDG Cities Challenge out of the Connected Cities Lab. Could you please talk a little more about that? I saw that it started this February and will run through February 2021. How's it going?
Having been to many events for cities on the SDGs and business and industry and other events, I really wanted to, understand how do we bring cities along the SDGs journey better than I had witnessed. And in that there's a huge amount of information out there about what the SDGs are, and there's lots of organizations putting the colored blocks or the beautiful 17 SDG colors and numbers on various publications. But moving from, I think that you've referred to it as SDG washing, how do we get underneath those blocks and underneath those numbers and connect cities in a way that makes sense to them. And so the SDG Cities Challenge is a knowledge exchange project, and the research component is understanding, which of those knowledge exchange opportunities derive the best understanding or the best outcome from the cities involved. At the moment, we've got 10 cities that have signed up in the Asia Pacific region, and learning from a whole range of tools that are out there already for cities and local government. Bringing these 10 cities together that applied to be part of it. They've identified a particular challenge that they'd like to use to understand the SDGs better, so that they're part of a project that hopefully gives them something back as well. We don't want them to reinvent wheels. We don't want them to come up with something that's not a real example. We want them to think about their real scenario around data or partners or budgets, and certainly in COVID, the impacts of city recovery for the sustainable development challenges that they've identified. We've got a whole series of webinars and workbooks and intensive workshops that are helping to unpack what the SDGs are around the challenges that they've identified. And all of the scaffolding around all of this is us, teasing out how cities are learning about the SDGs. It's a pilot year at the moment. Again, it's not necessarily rocket science in terms of the way it's being rolled out. So to your question about, could this be run elsewhere? Of course, it could be. If people are, wanting to get involved, they certainly can get in touch. But the idea is that towards the end of this year, we'll regroup and think about what we've learned and what the next phase could look like. And sharing that knowledge across the jurisdictions is key, probably, to solving the SDGs anyway.
Wow. Well, I'm so excited to see how the rest of this year shapes up with that project and to hear what the city's learned and the team at the lab has also learned from the pilot year. So we're down to the last few questions. This one's very personal for me. I'd like to know, why aren't young people, let's say under 30 years old, being utilized more in achieving the SDGs? And I mean utilized meaningfully, not just as tokens as we often are.
It seems quite simple to say it, but it's the future that we're imagining is the future of those that are under 30 right now, right? So, or even, my daughter's 7, it is surprising and often frustrating, and I hear your frustration, how much lip service, is paid to youth, or the tokenism, as you said, that really a lot of the solutions could come if we actually spoke to young people more and involve them as real members. Like, say, the city of Melbourne, the vast majority of our population are young. It's the median age is 28, I believe. We're a university town. We're a young town. How do we involve young people in decision making better? Is a really good question, and I think that's giving seats at the table and not having them as another, not just having a youth council or a youth group that you might consult with on one issue here or there, but how do you make space at the table for young people in a permanent way is something that everyone is challenged with, the United Nations downward. So maybe I better answer it in a more of a what am I doing about it, making sure that in the symposium program we've got young people actually as facilitators and as MCs and as speakers, so always making sure that young people have a seat on the panels or as keynotes or as contributors to the debate and to dialogue. That's always really important. And some of the cities that are part of our challenge are very much focused on kids and young people, like even younger than 30, but the child-friendly cities and looking at the SDGs actually explicitly through the lens of young people. So I think that's really important as well.
I've always thought young people, students, or just starting their careers are so eager, but also so competent and knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And I wondered, in the context of SDGs, maybe like, why don't cities have a youth task force for the SDGs, or actually use students and young professionals to help carry out the BLR, whether it's in a research capacity.
Of course.
Capacity. So I don't know what Melbourne's plan is for that.
You're right. Well, I know that University of Melbourne, they've just put out a survey around sustainability, and we were happy to be able to include some questions about the Sustainable Development Goals in that survey that's gone out. And I don't have the data yet, but I think right now we're still at that level of what are the SDGs. So we really need to get underneath and understand, well, what are they, and then what do they mean to me? And the idea of advisory boards or a task force of the SDGs, I think, is a really good point. And actually, you'll be glad, or maybe you could join one of the breakout sessions at the symposium that's linked to the SDG Cities Challenge, the SDGs Climate Change and Cities Symposium that is on the 1st and 2nd of October. One of the breakout sessions is going to be led by the student ambassadors, and it's all about engaging in the SDGs from a young person's perspective. So maybe you should join that session.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you again for your time. I have one last theme, I guess, that I want to ask you about. We've talked a lot about the SDGs, which is more formally known as Agenda 2030. So we're in now the second, entering the second half of 2020, and it means we've entered the decade of action and have exactly 10 years to achieve this Agenda 2030. As alluded, it's obviously no secret the world is behind where it needs to be. It's not on track. So in the context of our conversation, how can cities specifically step up to accelerate achievement? And also, what will the obstacles be for cities to effectively contribute over the next 10 years?
There's lots. So yes, there's a lot to do to achieve the SDGs, and that is certainly no secret. In terms of cities effectively contributing, it comes to a lot of what we've spoken about before, in that, the SDGs are, the SDGs are ultimately a national government responsibility. So some of the obstacles for cities is engagement from the national governments in the role of local government. That's why the voluntary local review process is exciting, because, whilst of course they're voluntary and, there's nothing mandatory about anything, but really you should see that there shouldn't be any obstacles to cities contributing, because you can just get on and do it yourself, and you can create indices that are related to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but make them relevant to you, make them, as far as possible achievable, but obviously you want to make them contributing to the greater good. So you don't want to set too easy a target, right? But you can get on and do it yourself. Obviously there are obstacles around jurisdiction and finance, and obstacles like climate change and poverty, and there are huge challenges that are tied up in the SDGs. So of course it's not easy in any way whatsoever, but certainly the first step is just being interested and being engaged and wanting to make a difference. And a lot of the obstacles are the same old obstacles that cities face anyway, so they're not really, it's not specifically tied to the SDGs. So the way I see it is that cities should get on and contribute, knowing that more and more people are moving into our city centres, and we know the impacts of climate change and other sustainable development challenges are coming, and the best you can do is make decisions that are evidence-based, forward-thinking, within your means, but aim high, I guess, is what I'd say.
Well, thank you so much for your fantastic insight.